Hello, today on Mental Health Discovery and Recovery, we have Dr. Laurie Nadel, and she's a Reiki master for animals. We're going to get to that at the end of this. Dan Rather praised her for her work in the book we're going to discuss today on a documentary she wrote and he narrated about the 9/11 Community Center. She's a survivor of Hurricane Sandy, and she's a trauma expert, both professionally and personally, because she's been through some stuff. So she knows how to help people through their stuff. And Oprah featured her book, The Sixth Sense, Unlocking Your Ultimate Mind Power. But today we're going to talk about the 5 gifts from Health Communications Incorporated. So welcome, Dr. Laurie, and we appreciate you being here. And we want to hear your story about becoming a journalist to a therapist.
Well, thank you so much for having me on the show. I really appreciate it. And thank you for your interest in my work and in the 5 gifts, which came about after I lost my home in Hurricane Sandy, but we can talk about that. Being a journalist and being a therapist, they're very similar listening skills. In both professions, we have to help somebody feel safe enough and comfortable enough talking about things they don't want to talk about, they don't want to reveal. But as a journalist, you're going to be publicizing or promoting or broadcasting or writing about those deeply held events or secrets or thoughts. And as a therapist, I often say to people, I keep secrets for a living. So whatever you say here stays here. It's like Vegas.
That is what we do.
That is what we do. And people bring some very unusual things into our rooms.
Legally bound.
That's right. And we have to create a safe space. And so for me, the transition, I was a journalist working in hard news for about 20 years. I worked in TV news in England, in London, and in New York. I worked in some pretty tough newsrooms at a time when there was no such word or term as sexual harassment. It was hazing, like, I guess, not quite as bad as women went through in West Point or Annapolis, but it was pretty rugged and extreme. And then by the time I got to CBS News, I'd already been working in the field as a reporter for Newsweek in South America and working in different newsrooms. And the industry had changed, and there were a lot more women, and it had become a lot more civil, as I would say, a lot more. And I think it was
More
also
civil.
Yeah, the culture at CBS was always great. Great people, very courteous, but the work was, it was pounding. It was every day, relentless. There would be pictures and videos coming in by satellite from all over the world of catastrophes and plane crashes and death and destruction. And you were just kind of processing these things, not with any sense of pleasure, but you had to develop a kind of clinical neutral screen like you do, I guess, you work in an emergency room. And one day, as I was looking up and looking at about 6 or 8 different satellite feeds of death and like Gaza scenes, about bombings and plane crashes and bodies being carried out. It suddenly the room got very quiet, and I was in this kind of, I guess it's a spiritual zone. I didn't know it at the time, and I heard this, like, my inner voice ask, is this what God sees when God looks at us? When God sees us, as his or her creation, is this what God sees us killing each other, sees all this destruction? And in that moment, I said, I have to do something else, but I didn't know what it was. I guess I felt like, so, and I said to my partner at the time, my writing partner, what happens to the people, who are, they're taking their kid to school and suddenly their child's leg gets blown off, or they're sitting at a cafe and there's a suicide bomber. And this was all, way before September 11th. We had never experienced that, in our country, on our shores
yet.
What happens to these people?
Yeah.
I said, who's going to support them? They're going to need help for the rest of their lives. And having gone through something where your sense of normal just gets napalmed, to use an old expression.
Yes.
The road that you're walking on is suddenly there's like a wall of fire or it gets blown away. What's going to happen to them? And he turned and he looked at me and he said, why do you care? Here's another story on a fire. And I thought, this is the business you're in. nobody cares. I'm
No
not supposed to
empathy.
do, you
Just who,
know,
what, when, where, why, how, no empathy. Wow.
and no long-term empathy. I mean, no, I fortunately, I was in that newsroom, people didn't make fun of people who were hurt and injured and maimed. I did work in some pretty dark
But they had to be
newsrooms.
pretty clinical in the
You had
moment.
to be very clinical, and it was, you don't get involved, and the volume of work was such that, why would you worry about somebody, you're going to see for 10 seconds in a cutting room, and then you're never going to see them again, because you'd have 100 more of these kinds of stories that you had to process sometimes in the course of a shift. So I didn't really, it kind of sat with me, and I started asking myself questions sometimes when I got home from a really bad news day, but the workload was relentless. And we had a very bad writer's strike in 1987, and I was out in the cold on the picket line. And then my daughter came down with a sore throat. She was 2, and then I caught her sore throat, and she got better. And then I found myself working the Iran-Contra hearings. And
Wow.
I was just working like nonstop, but I was very, very sick. And it turned out that I had a chronic fatigue virus. So after 6 months of I used to ask my colleague to go across the room to get the paper out of the printer, because I was too tired to get up and walk. I mean, I was really running on empty. And finally, when my doctor wrote a note to say, you need bed rest, when I stopped, I was like stopped dead in my tracks for 2.5 years. And I was so sick. I was so shocked at how sick I was. And I was also very disturbed to learn that, I don't know if it's changed, but there was no conventional medical treatment because it's a virus.
No,
And I
there was
thought,
not, and there kind of still is not. They
still
can do
isn't, there
some
still
things,
isn't.
but still is
That's right.
not. Yeah.
There still is not. So I thought, I can't, this can't be my life. I'm a proactive person. And I thought, what can I do? There must be something I can do. So I started reading the work of Dr. Herbert Benson, who wrote the book, The Relaxation Response. And he was the person who had gone up to the Himalayas and studied meditation with the monks. There's a wonderful video where he studied this inner fire meditation, where the monks are wrapped in sheets that are soaked in ice water. And because of this meditation, you see the steam rising from their bodies as their
Wow.
bodies actually warm the sheets. And Dr. Benson was the first book on mind body medicine, which was The Relaxation Response.
Mhm.
And I thought, well, this, makes a lot of sense. At the time, I didn't have any exposure to any kind of mindfulness wasn't a term yet. So I started meditation, and every day for the 20 minutes a day that I could sit up, I'm going to focus on something other than how horrible I feel. And maybe that's going to activate something. And in fact, years later, when I did get to study with Dr. Benson, I did clinical training in mind-body medicine. And I told him how his book had really inspired me to heal. And he said, yes, there was a principle that he discovered called remembered wellness. And when we go back into a moment when we were experiencing optimal wellness, it activates those molecules of emotion, and it helps the brain and the body to
Yes.
remember that we have that blueprint for healing and optimal health. Well, thank God, whatever it was that I was learning allowed me to recover in less than 3 years, which was about half the time most people suffered with that virus. And I was offered a job on the overnight shift. And I said,
Well, of course.
I don't think I can do it, but thanks for the offer.
Don't you love the humor of that, the irony of that?
I know, no, they talk about, no sense of
I
empathy.
just healed. Yeah.
It's like, yeah, I can really physically do that.
Yeah, right.
But I did start writing, and I ended up writing The Sixth Sense. And Sixth Sense was a book about how intuition is a natural mental ability that we all have. And as a result of interviewing some of the most amazing people, including astronaut Edgar Mitchell and Dr. Ernest Rossi, who had been he had been a Jungian therapist who studied with Dr. Milton Erickson. I learned all about the inner world, the whole idea that
Yes.
we have an inner world. And I thought, yes, because when I got sick, I had to discover my inner world because I couldn't go out and play in the external world. Right?
Yes.
So Jung says we have an external world of people, activities, and things, and we have an inner world of concepts and ideas. And that discovery really, when I was sick, that really opened the way for me to write Sixth Sense and to go back to school and to get master's and PhD in psychology. And then went on to get a doctorate in clinical hypnotherapy. And I opened my office in 1991, specializing in trauma and PTSD. At the time, I think I was the only therapist in New York. If you looked me up on Yahoo at the time, I was the only one that had a PTSD specialty, and helping people understand the relationship between stress and health, and
Yes,
how
it's huge.
when you overwork, and I've done this many times in my life, even though I know better. If you overwork, you will cross your stress threshold, and then you will crash your immune system, and then you can end up with all kinds of health complications,
Yes.
including autoimmune diseases, or being more susceptible to bacterial infections or viral infections.
Even cancer.
And
Yes. Yeah. Workaholics tend to just pass out and get cancer.
Right. So that's how I learned what I learned the hard way, and then was able to transition with some wonderful teachers in education into being able to be there for people who are struggling with many of the same issues that I had to learn how to I was going to say, you don't overcome them, you integrate them into how you look at life. They don't go away, but they change. It's like they change the lens through which you look at the world.
Yes, they do.
And
It's because today's whole discussion is going to be about post-traumatic growth. And I've always, and I want to hear your take on this, because I tell a lot of my clients as a therapist, trauma is not a competition. I hear so many of them minimize things. Like you said earlier, you lost your home in Hurricane Sandy. That's horrible. Some people might say, oh, I could never do that. And then some people may stub their toe, and I'm being very exaggerating here, not to offend anyone, but that may be traumatic for them. Trauma is not a competition. To those who are listening, you just heard what Laurie said about your brain, your mind, and your body. So some people have very resilient brains and some people don't. So could you address how Hurricane Sandy made you better at what you do? So many people say, oh, it's a wounded healer. No, I say it's a healer who was wounded, who's been there and can help you grow through it.
Well, I like that much better. Well, firstly, we're all wounded in some way.
In some way, flawed and wounded.
And especially, in this crazy world, right, where we are barraged with information that is, I say that anger and fear are a toxic cocktail, and we're barraged with messages that are designed to manipulate and stir up those two particular states, which are not productive physically, collectively, individually. And then we act based on how the discomfort or the pain of being angry and frightened. And so, again, to go back to Hurricane Sandy, I had a beach cottage. I raised my daughter. I was a single mom. I lived on a barrier island just south of New York City. And I loved we loved our little home. But when Hurricane Sandy came, it was the last weekend of October in 2012. And I lived in a neighborhood called the Canals. And so there are all these little finger canals. And the combination of the full moon and the high tide and being at the eye of the storm, suddenly the south wall of my little house, it made this sound like a zipper opening. And where the base of the wall met the foundation, it was just like, and all of a sudden the water just came rushing in. And one of the finger canals had flooded, and the water just came gushing into the house from that one canal. It wasn't even the one that was closest to the house, The main canal at the end of the block, which is the intercoastal, that didn't flood till like an hour or so later. And by that time, everything was floating. My washing machine was floating, my couch was floating, and there were little fountains of water that were spurting up from under the ground. Because if you think about a barrier island, the water table
Well,
shifts
it's called a
because
barrier island.
that's right, because then
It's
the
a
sea
barrier
level
to the
is
mainland and
rising,
it gets
and
hit first. Yeah.
there's no place for it to go, so it's coming up from underneath from underneath the floor, like these little fountains.
Oh my
And
gosh.
it was really very scary. It was very, very scary. So my partner and I, we put the poor cat was, I mean, he didn't know what happened. All of a sudden, all the floors were wet. He was in this one little corner of the house that was dry. And he looked at me like, "What's going on?" And I said, "Never mind what's going on. Put him in the box, put him up in the little crawl space." And then when the water reached kind of my chest level, I went upstairs, and then my partner came upstairs. And we just watched through the opening. The water was climbing up the stairs, but there was a beautiful silver spruce tree that was behind the house. And the wind was blowing about 110 miles an hour, and the tree was knocking against the roof. And I thought, oh my God, I mean, if that tree falls into the roof, then we're really going to be in trouble. It'll be like Hurricane Katrina, we'll be like waving our arms and hoping somebody will
Exactly.
come.
It was horrible. Yes. Yeah.
But the tree did not fall. And when the tide went out, fortunately, the barrier island had very strong tides, and the tide went out. We were able to kind of, step down the stairs, and everything was covered in sludge because the storm surge had destroyed the town's sewage treatment plant. And so all the water was contaminated. So it
Contaminated.
wasn't just seawater. It was oil, it was sludge, it was feces, everything was like on the walls and on the poor plants that I brought inside, everything. And it was the devastation of everything that I had built as a single mother after my divorce was right there in front of me.
And it
Everything
was
was gone.
literally ripped. You went from safety and feeling like your house would make it to it literally ripped off the foundation, which is what PTSD feels like. You're being ripped
Yes,
off the foundation of your
exactly.
life. It's like from safety to loss, and we're
Right,
hardwired for safety and connectivity, and then those get disconnected with trauma.
right. That's
But you
exactly.
built a community from it.
That's right. I did. Because I had run a program for teenagers whose fathers were killed in the World Trade Center attack, and I worked at a community center. We did a lot of activities. We ran retreats, I ran journaling workshops for the widows, and did a lot of activities and programs for the kids. I knew that healing from a disaster takes a few years. My
Yes.
boss said 3 to 5 years to recover from a disaster emotionally. So I started programs at City Hall and also at a local church. And I ran those programs for 4 years. But people don't realize that when you see, I was talking to somebody, the way, say, networks cover hurricanes, for example, you've got the, Al Roker at the weather map, then you have the Weather Channel shot, you've got the reporter standing
Yes.
there with the wind blowing and
With their
water in
windbreaker
the
on. I
background.
know.
And then,
I laugh
and
at
then,
those. I'm from Florida.
right,
Hurricanes are everywhere. We laugh at
right,
them.
right, you laugh at it at that point.
You can go inside and show it out the window.
Right, yeah, you show it
Yeah,
from
they
out the
want you
window.
to feel
And
the
then,
trauma. Yeah.
right, and then the storm breaks, and then you have the aftermath, and they show,
Oof.
people being rescued in
Mhm.
boats, and then you always have a few people crying because they've lost everything. And I have a chapter in the books from the 5 gifts on after the cameras leave. Because after the cameras leave, the help cycle lasts about 6 weeks. And then
Yes,
everybody's, the Red Cross,
they're gone.
they kind of leave. FEMA is out of there except to harass you with
Mhm.
paperwork and, to basically make you feel as though you've done something wrong by
Yes,
losing your house. I mean, they're not
exactly.
there to assist you. And I haven't found anybody who had a positive experience dealing with FEMA after any natural disaster. And suddenly it's like the whole foundation of your community, your landmarks, your procedures, your day-to-day life. It's like it's all gone. Everything is gone.
It's
And your
gone.
life becomes a struggle. Like you can spend 8 hours a day on the phone, just sitting on hold and then trying to deal with somebody who is accusing you of not having sent in the correct paperwork, when in fact you did send in the correct paperwork, but somebody in their organization misfiled it. So they
Yes.
have it in the computer, but meanwhile, they're accusing you of having done something wrong. They're going to penalize you. They're not going to let you have your insurance money. And you're fighting, you're dealing with unscrupulous contractors,
Right. And for
vendors.
years, this can go on for
They're like
years.
vultures. And that's the point. It goes on for years. Many people go bankrupt. Many people, I have a chapter in my book about financial trauma after
Yes.
disasters. Nobody talks about it.
No.
People walk away from their homes, people go bankrupt. People have to maintain 2 homes. I had to pay for the apartment that I was living in while my home was rebuilt.
Mhm.
And I had to pay the mortgage, the insurance, the taxes that were going
Yes.
up, the insurance that was going up, the construction costs that were going up, the other penalties that the town imposed because the town had to cover the cost of replacing the sewage treatment plant, and they had to replace the water mains and the sewers. We all had to pay for that, but the
All while
house
you're
was
raising a daughter.
unlivable. And yet I knew that what was happening to me, and this is where humility came in. I realized one day there were 1 million people who lost their homes in this disaster. So
Mhm.
even though this is happening to me, Laurie, it's really happening to 1 million people. And it's kind of sad to think that, that nobody cared what was happening to 1 million people. It's a lot of people
A lot
to
of
be going
people.
through that kind of devastation. But nobody outside of the affected area really knew about it or cared, because the news cycle is such that, after President Obama showed up for his 22nd photo op with
Mhm.
Governor Chris Christie, it was like the hurricane stories were over.
Right.
Now in
Next.
Manhattan,
Check next. Yeah.
the Manhattan had no electricity
Mhm.
from 34th Street south to Battery. My office was on 25th Street. I couldn't
My
go into
goodness.
work. I was living in a friend's basement over a month later because there was no electricity left. There was no electricity on the barrier island where I had to go back to live. It was just, I had a moment where I was sitting in a Starbucks, and it was in my old neighborhood in Brooklyn. And I was looking around, and I used to live around the block from that Starbucks. I thought, yeah, I think I'm tired. I think I'm going to go home. And then I realized you don't have a home,
You don't have
and
one.
you don't have a
Exactly.
home. I mean, that's a startling thing to
Yeah.
realize that, the home that you had built over 20 years, you
Yes.
didn't have a home anymore.
Yeah. And people
You know,
face this in divorce. They
that's
face it
right.
in other tragedies. We have fires in
Right.
California. We got floods. I don't think people realize how much natural disasters affect it. And I love it that you talk about after the camera's gone. I lived in DC during 9/11. I drove past the Pentagon 2 days later, and it, I it it was overwhelming. Here, that's my vagus nerve. We'll talk about a vagus nerve later, but it causes me to stutter because there are no words for that.
Right.
And people
Yes.
just go on like it never happened. And I have revisited there. I did go to the Phoenix Center, which, what a perfect name for that. Out of the ashes, again, post-traumatic growth, but what terrible ashes. I mean, you had no home to go home to.
That's
And
right.
there's people every day. I'm not one of those people that believes there's a reason for everything. I have a hard time believing. I couldn't say that to someone who was in your position back then. What's your take on there's a reason for everything? I think there's a purpose that can be garnished from everything. But
I
do you
think
feel
we
there's a
have to
reason for
find,
that?
I think we have to find the purpose.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think there's, I mean, I don't think there's like a chart, or PowerPoint or
I
a
don't either.
book, that will
Yeah.
give you the reason, and a kind of what do you say, like a textbook kind of a reason. I think it gives us the opportunity to find those reasons, to find purpose and meaning. And there was one day, I don't know, remember how many months afterwards, and I was completely drained. And I was afraid that my life was, the rest of my life, I was just going to be fighting with insurance companies. The bank the bank that holds your mortgage confiscates your insurance settlement check, and they put it in an account and they dole it out a little bit at a time. And that particular bank, which I will not mention, was particularly nasty. And somebody in the bank notified my insurance company that I had not been living in my house that had homeowners insurance for 20 years with that particular company. And that under New York State insurance
You
law,
have to live
if
in the
your house
house.
is unoccupied after 90 days and you have not notified the insurance company, they have to cancel your homeowner's insurance. And the reason the bank did that was because they had their own insurance company where they could then rip you off to buy their insurance policy for 2 or 3 times as much as you were paying.
Greed.
So I received a letter from my insurance company. We are canceling your homeowner's insurance. And I called them. I called a number of people, and nobody had heard of this. And only one person told me that she'd been an insurance broker and that, yes, there was a law on the books. And I called the insurance company and they said, well, we got a letter from your bank. I said, well, let me explain what's going on. But I said, didn't you think to look up my property address in your computer? Don't you know that this is a Hurricane Sandy house? Don't
No,
you
they
know
don't
that
care.
don't you know that it's not that I'm not living there? It's that my house is unlivable. It has no
Uninhabitable, yeah.
electricity, no power, no plumbing. But you know that because you gave me money to fix it. And if you just plug in the address, you will see that
Yes.
my house is not unoccupied. My house is unlivable. And I would like to know who at the bank notified you. And she sent me a copy of the letter that was sent, and it was just stamped. Like the coward that sent it didn't even put their name on it. That's how vicious it was. Constant harassment. And I thought, this is going to break me. So I
And so
asked myself,
you noticed that other people around you were going through the same humiliation. So it's amazing you're a gift of humility. Most people wouldn't call that a gift. That's
oh,
humiliation. Can you kind
yeah.
of define humiliation versus humility and why humility is for post-traumatic growth and humiliation will keep you stuck?
Well, humility is where you realize, listen, we're not special. And I keep reminding myself that what I was going through was, I mean, it was devastating to me, but it was devastating to the other 999,999 people who were going through the same thing. And that in life, nobody's life is without hardship or disaster. And that, mine was, maybe say, like you were saying, there's no hierarchy of trauma.
No.
And unfortunately, let me add that several of the people who were in my support group experienced that humiliation from other people who would say things like, I don't know what you're complaining about. My grandmother was in Auschwitz. You hear like a lot
Oh,
of
yeah, competition, the
well, you
competition.
hear that a lot of people will say to the person who's traumatized, somebody else had it worse. You have no right. And the person who was traumatized in this particular instance hadn't even said anything. Somebody had told this other person at a family function that she had lost her house in the hurricane. She wasn't going around talking about it.
Right.
And this third party person that she didn't even know came up, I don't know what you're complaining about. My grandmother was in Auschwitz. I said, you can't compare tragedies.
No,
And I certainly can't say that what happened to me was better or worse than what happened, to somebody else. But
no.
it
But
it
it's happening
it,
to you. It
it was
happened to you.
happening to
So
me.
this is what
And
not to say if someone's listening to all that, what not to
yes,
say to people, that
yes,
what not to
yes,
say is, oh, that's nothing. It could be so much worse.
right, right,
Not what it's what
absolutely.
not to say. Yeah.
Well, a lot of what not to say, sometimes people want us to get better so that they don't have
So
to
they
look
feel
at us.
better.
Right, exactly. They'll look at you and they'll say, well, what happened to her could happen to me. Very often with trauma, something happens to us that, we were helpless to prevent. We're just walking along and suddenly the ground got pulled out from under you and a plane flew into a building, or there was a
Yes.
fire, or there was an accident. And anything like that could happen to anybody. And so when, especially people who care about us, sometimes it will trigger their sense of helplessness. And since people don't like to feel helpless, they'll try to fix us. And they'll
Yes.
try to fix us by shaming us into not feeling so bad about
Right.
whatever it is that we're experiencing. I decided that I would take my own advice. It's very hard to live our own advice, right?
It's so
And I
hard.
thought, very hard. I thought, if somebody came to you and came into your office and told you what you were going through, what would you tell them? And I would say, well, turn off the phone for 48 hours, just practice self-care, get a massage, take a nap, take a walk, eat some good food, just try to reset. And as I was finally calm enough to meditate, I was asking in my meditation, is this what the rest of my life is going to be like? And I have a guide. I've come to think that it's an angelic guide, certainly a higher power or a source of higher wisdom than I personally am capable of. And this voice whispered these 5 words: humility, patience, empathy, forgiveness, growth. And the voice
Wow.
said, write them down. And these are 5 gifts that will help you to get through this and any other disaster in life, and share them with your people and with your group.
Which is what we're doing now. And
We're doing now.
patience, everyone hates to hear it, but it takes time, and patience
Yes.
is a virtue, but it comes with a lot of trial. And I
Yes.
really don't like when people say there's a reason for everything, or whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. That's not true. It can actually make you weaker. I'm
But
just going
sometimes,
to
yeah,
throw that in there, because you had a virus that made you weaker.
right.
Whatever doesn't kill you can make you weaker physiologically.
That's
So
right.
patience, can you talk about the patience aspect of the 5 gifts, how
Well,
that's a gift? Because people don't feel like patience is a gift in this instant gratification society we live in.
Well, culturally, I mean, nobody wants humility. We want 1 million followers on Instagram. So humility is kind of like, well, what happened to me? And it's not that it's not important, but it could happen to anybody. And so it takes the edges off, that humiliation of, why is this happening to me?
Yes.
Humility is, well, why not me? It could happen to anybody. And patience is the gift that helps us accept that the hurt can go on much longer than we think it should. And this is true with any kind of healing, physical healing.
Yes.
It's not a straight line. You can get better and then you can relapse, and you get better and you can relapse. And you have to be patient on the days that you relapse or the months that you relapse. And our culture doesn't model patience. Everything is like it's got to be now, and people have
Yes.
very short attention spans. So patience requires that we just kind of surrender and allow ourselves to accept that today I really don't feel good about what happened, or today I'm hurt. In grief work, when traumatic grief, when you have a flashback, we call it a STUG, which is a sudden temporary upsurge of grief, which is really a flashback where your body re-experiences the immediate loss.
Yes, it does.
And patience is the gift that allows us to say, I just feel terrible today, or I'm overwhelmed, or it feels like it did when this happened the first time. And then the 3rd gift is empathy. And, empathy is really the feel-good gift. But
Well,
as we're saying,
unless you're an empathic person, you feel too much of it all the time
right,
and don't know how to
unless you feel too
control
much
that.
of it,
But
right.
empathy is, well, talk about that. Empathy is amazing, but it's it's a blessing and a curse, as the people
It can
who
be a
are
blessing
empathic.
and a
I'm one of
curse.
those people. Like, you could feel
Yeah,
too much for too long, then you
that's
get vicarious trauma too. And
it's
it is a
true. Yeah.
survival tool. We had talked about that when we had spoken before, and that empathy is a survival tool that comes down through humans. If we recognize each other's pain and suffering, like in Hurricane Sandy or 9/11, then we can, as a community, heal. But not the outsiders looking in don't see that. They see
Right.
the people that they want to say, can't you get over that? Address
Right.
them.
Yeah, what's
Address
wrong
the
with you?
people that lack some empathy. Yeah, it's even our diagnostic manuals. I don't think people will like to hear this, but we can share our grievances too. But even our diagnostic manuals say that if someone isn't over grief or bereavement in a
Yeah.
year, we give them a year,
Right.
365
Right.
days, 52 weekends to heal, then it's major depressive disorder. I'm like, no, some
Right.
people can be sad for a
That's
long
right.
time. They're finally turning that into complex bereavement,
Right. Right.
murders,
Yeah.
suicides, different kinds of death, not tragic ones like 9/11. They're showing,
Right.
okay, there is a different response there. We need to acknowledge that.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that's very, very important. I talk about in chapter 3, I talk about the culture of first responders, and first responders are empathy warriors. They go in
Yes.
every day and they deal with, they deal with traumatic events every day on every shift. I was on the debriefing team. We worked with first responders and administrators and teachers at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School after the Parkland shooting,
Mm.
and I developed and talk about them in the book, emotional first aid tools that can help to they can help to neutralize the flashback very quickly so that it doesn't become a panic response.
Yes.
And they're tools that we can share with kids, because every time there was a fire drill bell, everybody was jumping out of their skin,
Terrified. Mhm.
including the kids. So, I was very humbled and very grateful that the book was, we gave the book out to all the teachers in the high school, and that, that the 5 gifts were helpful in terms of the long-term healing after what was really a massacre in that
Yes.
community.
And do you
I've
think we're
worked
desensitized? You're a journalist. I'm asking you a really, I used to be in the entertainment industry, which is very different, but we know that they're not so far apart these days,
so far,
and they're
yes.
not so far apart. And I mean, I tell people who watch murder shows sometimes, I said, you do realize you're watching someone's murder for
Right.
entertainment. I said, just want
Mhm.
you to know what you're watching, not judging, just
Yeah.
observing. You're watching
Right.
some. Do you think we've become desensitized and that empathy is harder to come by these days? Or do some people have more of it? Just discuss your general organic thoughts about empathy, where it is, how you could get it if you don't have it, and why it's so important.
I think it's mixed. I think that people who are watching a lot, again, I mean, I was trained in newsrooms, but now everybody's got a newsroom, on your phone, and people who are watching TikTok, or people who are watching, the Murder Channel, or people who are breaking news, local news coming in on their phones, are probably desensitized because the images come in so quickly
Mhm.
and you don't really have a chance to process them. But I think on a bigger kind of big picture cultural level, I think more and more people are becoming aware of the need for empathy, because without it, we're not going to survive as a species. And
We will not.
years ago,
Someone will
my
push the
first,
red button.
right,
They
and
will
my
do it.
for my first book, The Sixth Sense, I interviewed Dr. Jonas Salk, and he wrote a book called
Yeah.
Anatomy of Reality, The Merging of Intuition and Reason. And she said, if we don't evolve into a more intuitive, empathic species, we will make ourselves extinct for no other
Yes.
reason but that we're smart enough to have figured out how to do it,
Yes,
right?
it's now survival of the wisest. And you mentioned Carl Jung earlier, and he talked about introverted intuitives. Now the world
Right,
calls them highly sensitive or empathic people. And he noticed that 20% of the population is born empathic. I remember when I heard that, I went, oh, great, 80% do not understand me. Because people will
right,
say to me, Mary, like, really, you think about that when you're seeing an old ruin, or you think about, I can't walk in places like the Coliseum or the Pentagon. Every day I drove past it, I would put one,
yeah, yeah,
could do it safely.
yeah,
I would just avert and get past it
mhm, yeah,
every day for years. And yes,
yes.
because I saw it over and over and over and over. You can't help but not see it. So sometimes it's hard, but I'd almost rather be that way than desensitized to the other way. And I
Well, I
think
mean,
I think people are trying to get some back, but we're losing it at the same time.
Well, I don't know that we're trending, and I don't know that empathy is trending in enough numbers, that we need it to trend to kind of really make a shift. However, I know that it will start to grow with the hardship that seems to be coming. So, we don't really want to get into, kind of seeing around the corner. Carl Jung said
Right.
intuition, the ability to see around the corner. He also said that only 4% of the population are introverted intuitives. So,
4%.
yeah,
Wow.
4%. Yeah.
4%, even
Yeah.
less.
Even less, right. So when you are an intuitive feeling person, if you're introverted and intuitive feeling, meaning
Mhm.
that you tend to be quieter and more reserved,
Yes.
but you are able to feel what other people are feeling. And then you'll wonder, well, how could somebody do that? I would never respond that way. We don't realize that most people don't respond the way we respond.
No,
Uh, and
no. And that's okay. Yeah.
it's genetic. I mean, I think it's just, it's wiring really, it's in our
Yes.
DNA. But our culture, this particular culture that we live in, is not, has not been, it didn't grow the basis of empathy or humility or patience being highly valued criteria, which is why when I was first talking to Dan Rather about the book, and I said that, I think that the kind of disasters that we have and the things that are coming are such that we need to learn from other countries and cultures, indigenous cultures, third world cultures, first
Yes.
responder cultures, places where they have been living with hardship and war and dictatorship and disaster for years and years and years. And these are the traits that I have found in traveling to some real forgotten, out of the way, remote places, especially in the Southern Hemisphere. Humility. You see people who don't have indoor plumbing,
They have nothing.
have food, they have humility, their faces shine from within. They'll give you their last, cup of milk and
Yes.
be offended if you don't drink it. There's a graciousness to that level of humility.
Yes.
Patience, you know, if if there's a landslide and there's only one road that is going from one town to the other town, you're not going anywhere until, everybody pitches in and digs out the road. So,
So empathy
living
is a
with this kind
survival
of,
tool if we
that's
don't
right,
devolve. We need to evolve. This
exactly.
the higher self of all people when that collective consciousness Carl Jung talked about needs to kind of come up a bit when those things happen.
That's
And it
that's
does
right.
when those things
And
happen. I
it does.
remember after 9/11 everybody was pitching
Yes,
together. Yeah,
that's
and
right.
then we go back to whatever the new normal is and forget.
Yeah, unfortunately, as one of my boss at the World Trade Center program, that the help cycle lasts 6 weeks. And then everybody's off, the cameras have gone. And, you're looking at 3 to 5 years of trying to put your psyche back together, relationships that have shattered because people can't deal with the pain that you're going through, the
Yes.
helplessness that you feel, the anxiety, the very real financial and physiological losses, the horror that the widows of 9/11 experienced when they would get a knock on the door at 10 at night and a police officer would come in with a little box that had like a 1/3 of a finger, say, well, we've identified this as the
Yes, I
remain.
remember I
Yeah,
read that in your book. That was horrific. I did not know that was
horrible.
happening.
Right. And so empathy, again, this is the gift that allows us to stay connected through the long haul. I talk about it. We need empathy for the long haul and forgiving. I
Yeah.
mentioned in my book the used examples of the reconciliation movements in Rwanda, where 800,000 people were murdered by a machete or
Horrible.
rage attacks over a 2 month period, 800,000 people. Reconciliation movements in South Africa, where there was apartheid for
Horrible.
generations.
Yes.
We really need to learn how to model forgiving, because until we do, our country is going to become even more divided because everybody's drinking that toxic cocktail of anger and fear. And
Yes.
forgiving is really the antidote to that, and forgiving
And even
ourselves.
understanding, yes, and forgiving yourself, you just mentioned that's the hardest thing to do.
Yes, it
The
is.
hardest person of all to forgive is yourself.
Yeah,
Ooh,
yes.
can you talk about that?
Well, we always, I hear this a lot. I have a program. We have a program from the Pulmonary Wellness Foundation. We've been running a support group for long COVID people. It meets every Sunday evening at 7. It's free. You go to pulmonarywellness.org. And people who are living with the stigma of chronic illness, with again, it's a mysterious illness that has complicated and devastated people's lives. That media doesn't talk about it anymore. It's really quite shocking. And the psychological complications of living with a severe chronic illness, over a period of time. People need support because it's very isolating to be sick.
Yes,
And,
it is.
one of the things that comes up usually after a year is that people start to ruminate and say, well, if I hadn't gone to the theater, if I hadn't gone to the party, if I hadn't done this, if I hadn't, they start to kind of judge themselves and blame themselves. And
Yes.
so, it's very
Survivor
important,
guilt. Coulda, shoulda, woulda.
right, to emphasize, to teach people how to stop ruminating, how to get out of the room of rumination and forgive yourself. Whatever you did, it wasn't done with the intention of harming yourself and other people.
It's all about
And
intent, isn't it? I'm not sure people there, there's guilt and shame, and we talk about that. Guilt is I did something bad, shame is I am bad, and that can become toxic. And guilt is there for a reason to keep us in check. But if you didn't do something with intent, you
right,
didn't, you were doing the best you could with what you had. And when people are in survival mode, like hurricanes,
right,
like 9/11, things happen. I mean,
that's
COVID,
right,
people, oh my gosh, the things that were off the shelves at the stores, I was like, why is that? How are they putting a virus together with that particular product? I never could understand it. But then I thought, it's just what you're talking about. We're getting a gift from this. I think I call these the gifts that come in very ugly brown paper wrappers, but you have
Mhm.
discovered them. And from that, you can choose. I've always said, I won't say the real word, manure, the trauma.
Uh-huh.
I've been through some traumas, and there was one in particular was the worst. I'll spare people the story. But I went, oh, manure,
Mhm.
fertilizer. I can
Right,
stay stuck or I can use it to grow, but to
right,
use manure for fertilizer, things have to dry out a bit. It takes time, it
that's
takes
right,
patience, humility.
that's right.
I mean, it's just
Yes,
amazing that fertilizer comes from manure. So
that's right.
that's where post-traumatic growth comes in. Can you relay about the beauty of growing and finding purpose out of the pain?
Well, I think, growth is when we can look back at horrible things that happen. And I can say, I wish it never happened to me. And I certainly would never wish it on anybody else. But if it hadn't happened to me, I wouldn't have become who I am today. I wouldn't have learned what I've learned. I wouldn't have met the most amazing people that I've met along the way, the people who've become part of my journey. The people, very often the people you think are going to be there are not the people who are there, and you meet new
Correct.
people, or strangers, or a neighbor that you never really connected with.
Mhm.
Or people materialize, and it kind of opens you up to what Native Americans say is expecting the unexpected. And
Yes.
so post-traumatic growth, I think, is the awareness that we can expect the unexpected, and that unexpected wonderful things can happen. It's not always about unexpected horrible things that can happen.
Yes, I love this conversation, and we're gonna go there. I don't know a whole lot of things in life. It's the older I get, the less I know. That's how I
Yeah,
always say. The older I get, the more I learn, the less I know. But one thing I have learned is that wonderful and horrible happen simultaneously. Our
that's
brains
true.
tend to focus on the horrible to keep us safe, to remind
Right,
us that can happen, this can happen, that can happen, this can happen. This is what makes helicopter moms. They've been through
right.
something that makes them scared. But on the same token, if we stop and go, okay, there's something wonderful happening here. Like even in Hurricane Sandy, I bet you met neighbors who live right down the street from you you'd never seen before in your life.
We had some connections with people, and it's funny because you see the most, like acts of pure generosity,
Yeah.
like people we didn't know come over and say, "Listen, we have electricity in our house.
Sharing.
Can we charge your cell phone for you?" But the neighbor across the street wouldn't let us charge our phones in her car, so I only have enough battery power for me. So it's a combination of like almost like this
The best and
tremendous.
worst, wonderful and horrible simultaneously.
Wonderful and horrible, either people kind of rose to great heights of generosity, or people defaulted to Lord of the Flies. And, it can
Yes,
happen, either,
my
they could both happen
my favorite,
simultaneously.
least favorite book. Yes, we're
Right.
oh, the Lord of, and if people haven't read The Lord of the Flies, well, it might be a good time to revisit that
Yeah.
classic. It's a
And
classic
yeah,
for a
this would
reason.
be a good time.
It
Yes.
is, because
Yeah.
we're kind of looking at that mentality now, as when it
Yeah.
divided, we fall. Entire societies fall. I mean,
Yes.
we've seen great empires fall, and we don't want
Yeah.
to be one of them. And the way to do it is through things like humility,
Right.
patience, forgiveness. And if you can't reach a point of forgiveness, that's a really hard word for some people. Can you just start with trying to understand? Wouldn't you agree that just understanding someone's viewpoint without attacking them for it is a way to, is a key to the door that might unlock the concept of forgiveness that's so hard for people?
Very much so, just accepting. And I always say that, forgiveness, unfortunately, we think of forgiveness as like a light switch. So it's like an on off, I forgive or I don't.
Yeah.
But if you think of it as it's part of a spectrum, and we could be forgiving 5%
Yes.
today or 20% tomorrow. And we may never be 100% forgiving
Correct.
of ourselves or of the perpetrator or of the event
Exactly.
or of the government or of the person who hurt us, but we can be forgiving
Forgiving.
to grant, and as
We
long
don't
as
have to forget. People think
that's right.
that means, I don't know, forgiveness became synonymous with forgetting, and that sometimes will seep into spiritual practices, which we're going
Right.
to get to in a second because you're a Reiki master. And I really want to hit home to people because I was raised in different, I very diverse spirits, Carl Jung, individuation. I'm very individuated, but I notice all the similarities are there's a dark side of all faiths that you can give to, you give out.
Right.
You can. So, and forgiveness does not mean forgetting and inviting the perpetrator back in your house.
Right.
It is not what it means. So we just wanted to pause and let people know that, because post-traumatic growth cannot happen without at least some form of forgiveness toward even if you can only start with the world as a fallen place. And I want to do my little part and my piece of it to hold each other up, which is what we're doing here today. So talk
Yes.
about Reiki work, because we discussed the vagus nerve earlier, and my throat got choked up earlier because I have a vagus nerve, and it's a nerve that's it is absolutely not able to discern between your negative and positive emotions. It reacts to your fight, flight, or frozen responses. If you can find a better way to say it, I'm just trying to make it easy for people. And talk about what Reiki does, what it is, because dogs have vagus nerves, most mammals do. It is a bundle of nerves. When we say we're a bundle of nerves, we actually are.
That's so true. Reiki is not ancient, but it's been around, I guess probably close to 200 years. It's a form of healing that was originally discovered in Japan. And I say discovered because Reiki means universal life energy. And it's a force field that's around us all the time. Just
Mhm.
like you'd say love is a force field that's around us all the time. And even though most people think of Reiki as like a hands-on modality where you come in and you lie down, when you get into what they call level 2 or being a Reiki master, you're working with sacred symbols that dissolve the boundary between time and space. So this is really quite remarkable because it is possible to connect energetically with the energy or the soul of another being. In this case, with animals are very receptive to Reiki. Somebody will send me a picture, for example, of their horse. I did a radio show, Coast to Coast, AM, and we were talking about this. And this man wrote to me from Montana. He had a horse that wouldn't get out of the stable. She was just lying there, and
Oh.
asked if I could offer her Reiki. And I'm trained in the Let Animals Lead School of Reiki, which means that I'm not sending you Reiki. I'm just asking you, I do a meditation to enter into that energy of Reiki, which is, I think of it as like an ocean of unconditional kindness. And I will look at a picture of an animal and I will connect with that picture. And I will say, once I've used that symbol to dissolve the space-time barrier, and I'll say, well, would you be open to Reiki right now? And sometimes horses are funny because horses will tell you right away if they don't want it. My friend's horse, she asked if I would, do Reiki for her horse. I said, well, I'd have to ask the horse
You have
if
to
she
ask.
wanted.
I used to have horses, so I understand what
Yeah.
asking the horse means. No, neither one of us are crazy here. Horses have eyes that will tell you what they
Oh,
do and
okay.
don't want.
Oh, that's tell you what they do not want. So the horse said to me,
Or they
I
stomp on
don't,
you.
she said, I don't know, you go away.
Yes, or
So
then
my
they will. They'll
friend,
just stomp on your foot. They just do it.
yeah, my friend called me and she said, how did the Reiki session go? I said, well, the horse told me, she said she didn't know me and she wanted me to go away.
Yeah.
And my friend laughed and said, oh, that sounds just like her. So this particular horse was very, she was sad, she was having trouble walking. She felt very wobbly on her legs, but she'd
Oh,
been in the stable for like over a month. And so I offered her Reiki and it kind of stayed connected through what I call it like the ocean of calm. That is the essence of Reiki, that pool of unconditional kindness. And a couple of days later, I got an email saying, I don't know what you did, but she got up and she walked out of the barn and she's outside in the paddock now. And I get feedback like that from people all over the country and even in other countries.
so you
That's
can do
how
this remotely.
powerful.
You can do this work
I do this
remotely.
remotely. It's all remote work. And, I offer it as a service the first session to see whether it works because if it doesn't work, it isn't. But then, after the first session, I have a fee. But I have a website, animalreikiplanet.com, or you can email.
AnimalReikiPlanet.com. I will put that in the notes on
Thank you.
YouTube, and then we'll mention it on podcast. Of course, I usually run these simultaneously, but yes.
And there's a phone number where you can text me a picture of the animal, with a little description of what help you need. And it's 305-778-1772.
Could you
And
repeat that so
yeah,
people can hear it again?
305-778-1772. And
Great. People need that. I mean, having had horses, they do, they don't talk to you like Mr. Ed.
no,
But they do have personalities, and science
right.
has studied them. There's equine therapies as horses and people have very similar fight, flight, and frozen responses. And boy, you
Yes.
don't want one to have a fight response. They're 1,400-pound 4-year-olds when they get that fight response. But I
Yeah.
appreciate the work that you do. And
Thank you.
horses teach us patience
So horses teach us patience. All
and
animals,
humility for certain, because we're just so much
definitely.
smaller than them.
Definitely humility, yes.
Yes.
I'm very humbled that I was called to do this work with animals. I've always loved animals, and it's magic for me when I can sit down and I can meditate, and then later when I'll text the human, and I don't refer to the human as an owner because we don't own animals.
No.
They just let us hang out with them, and
Right.
they honor us by letting us hang out with them. And I'll say, well, during the meditation, this is what I felt. I can use that picture once the ritual has dissolved the barrier between time and space. I can put my hand over the image that they send, and I'll pick up, where there's static or where there's coldness or where there's fear or just, I just pick it
Wow.
up
Yeah.
energetically in my palm, and which is actually one of the techniques that they teach us when we study remote viewing, which is the technique that the military used for psychic spying. So,
Yes.
you
I've
really
heard of
learn
that.
to
Yes.
use your body as a kind of a receiver, I use my hand as a receiver, not a transmitter of
And
Reiki.
introverted intuitives know all about that. So 4% I've discovered now. So you 4%ers out there, which means 96% of the population does not quite understand. But
So, yeah.
yes, you're picking up promptings. And like you said, way before when we started this discussion, You think everybody has intuitive skills. I do too. I think everyone can tap into them. You can be a 4%er. You can make that 4% grow by being open-minded and empathetic and have, there's it cracked me up one time. Somebody said, I'm very humble. And I went, well, you can't, you
Yeah,
can't be
doesn't work that way.
humble if you
Yeah.
say you're humble.
If
So
you're proud of being humble, yeah. It's very
bragging
funny.
about
That
being
knocks
humble.
me, that knocks me
I have a
down.
sense of humor. I had to call the person out on it. It wasn't a client, I can say that. But I think if people would just learn that humility is not humiliation, and
Right.
that forgiveness isn't forgetting, and
Yeah.
patience, yes, it takes time, but it's also you learn so much in there. And
Yeah.
that empathy is a survival tool. It really, if we do not get some empathy soon, especially like it's an election year, or just name any government right now, that the world is in chaos. I always say we're kind of set up for World War II and a half. I think, we're kind of in that point. So with some empathy and understanding, even if you totally disagree with that side, that's going to help people. And that the post-traumatic growth is where we're going to really start
Yeah.
to evolve instead of devolve. And
Well, I think
I
we
appreciate your
are
work.
we're a resilient society. And I remember when I
Yes, we
first
are.
explained to Dan Rather that I was writing a book about these 5 values that people in other countries had, that helped them to deal with a lot of hardship and disaster. He looked at me and said, but Laurie, those aren't American values. And I said, that's the point.
That's the
We
point.
kind of lost our way. And
Yes.
because we're
As
going
all
through
great, quote unquote, great societies, I'm doing that because people are listening, not watching, but quote unquote, great societies do lose their way sometimes. They become
yeah,
great and then they become complacent, and
right,
complacency is the enemy.
exactly. Yes, it
Nobody
is.
can say we're the greatest country in the world. We should all say we're a great country, but we could be better. I mean, if
Right.
everybody would
And
just strive for better, the world would be a better place. It would be.
there's a kind of petulance that people have, and I'm talking about a lot of, on air reporters, and that how could this be happening to us? And this is an outrage. And, things that what we're going through has happened to so many countries and so many
Mhm.
democracies.
Yes.
And the hardship that people go through because of climate change events and, because of, other horrifying events. Um, Other countries have been through this, other spiritual traditions have, in a non-denominational way, have
Yes.
teachings about how to get through these types of experiences. And we have, talk about a reason, we have an opportunity now to learn almost like a new language of, yeah, how can we get through this together? It's like a new language of resilience so
Yes.
that are American values. These are human values.
And bring
They
back
don't
diplomacy. Just
they don't
diplomacy.
belong to
Diplomacy
any
doesn't
one
mean you
culture.
agree, right? I'm sorry,
Right.
go ahead. And
No, I was
diplomacy
just
doesn't
saying
mean you agree.
doesn't belong to any particular culture or religion. It's not right or wrong, but they can really help us to get through these turbulent times, the hardship that we're going through, and to feel like, why is this happening to us? This is like America, please stop whining about it and
It's
let's
happened
learn
to other
what we can.
societies before.
That's right.
That's
That's
another thing
right.
introverted intuitives do. I've learned in my studies of it that, which I thought were 20%, I stand corrected, but they love history. And
Yes.
I bore my friends with history, and I won't bore anybody on this show, especially you, Laurie. I won't do that. But
No, I agree with
history is
you.
studied
History,
because we learn from it. We don't repeat it. That's in our
right.
personal lives. I say macrocosm, microcosm. In the macrocosm, we see, societies fail. In the microcosm, we see little family members do the same things over and over. We need to learn from our family trees, from
Right.
our patterns of our own behavior, and
Right.
from big things in history. There's metaphors everywhere. People just notice them. They just
That's
have to
right.
notice them.
And we need to look at history now, I think, in
Yes.
order to have hope, in order to see that we're not the first, we're not the only country that's faced the loss of democracy, that we're not the only country that's been plagued by natural disasters and other types of catastrophes.
No.
The whole planet is in upheaval, and we as a species need these 5 gifts if we're going to survive together as humanity.
Yes.
That's how I feel anyway.
Well, thanks for bringing them to us. And before we go, I just want to bring up something to everyone. With this this person that I'm talking to, Dr. Laurie Nadel, she knows about trauma because you just heard her story about going through Hurricane Sandy. And I don't think she would mind me telling you this because I don't have to say exactly where it is because we keep secrets. She moved to Florida, Hurricane Central. I live there
Right.
too. And so do you see how you can just face your fears and talk about that you moved from hurricane hell with Hurricane Sandy and then said, I'm gonna go to the place where hurricanes hit the most. Tell
Well,
people how
yes.
you did that.
I sometimes think, well, I'm not, maybe not playing with a full deck there. But then when I look at, as I was talking to somebody, I said, well, but you could move to Vermont and, the hurricanes can sweep up the coast. You can move to the middle of the country because you don't want to be near a hurricane. And then you have
Tornadoes.
tornadoes. There are tornadoes, there are blizzards, there were droughts. I mean, there are forest fires. So it's almost as though I grew up with hurricanes and,
Yes. And you're a climate change expert too. I know we didn't touch on that much today, but I always say the weather is just full of metaphors. It rains, it shines, it rains, it shines. That's just life in general. Wonderful, horrible.
I'm hoping that, if I see that there's a big one headed this way, I mean, I tend to try to, I'll say one thing. I'm prepared in that I do not own any property anymore.
Right. And you can leave.
Near the ocean. And I can leave. That's right. All I have to do is just look
I
for
leave
and go
if
to
I
high
can.
ground or go inland. And, if it floods, oh, I've already lost everything. So
Yes.
it's something that there's a wonderful Chinese author, and he wrote, everything I carry with me, and everything I will be lies waiting in the road ahead. And I really feel that
Beautiful.
hurricane ultimately gave me that. I and I think my ancestors, my dad told my ancestors were gypsy somewhere, several generations back. So I just said, well, okay,
Oh,
maybe it's
that's
in my
beautiful.
DNA, just,
I
whatever
used to be, I was a songwriter in Nashville, and it reminds me of Chris Christopherson's words because he wrote Me and Bobby McGee of freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose.
Yeah, way it's
So do you
true.
see how that's reframing? People say I've lost everything. Well, I don't have anything else to lose. I can start over now. Rock bottom is a place you can push off from. So
Yeah,
thank you
then
for sharing all these gifts with us.
an openness. I think, emptiness holds a lot of promise. And
Mhm.
we don't like emptiness, it's one of those things like humility. It's an uncomfortable state, but it gives us a lot of potential. And I think that, what we're going through right now, as turbulent as it is, it hopefully was going to awaken potential in us as a people to come together like we did after 9/11, to cultivate a collective resilience.
Yes.
I'd also like to mention, I have a paper that I wrote. It's a report on introverted intuitives, managing diversity in the workplace. I'll be happy to send it to anybody who would like to contact me through my website, laurienadel.com or animalbreakyplanet.com. Just say you want the introverted intuitive report or the intuitive report, and I'll happily email it to you.
Oh, thank you. And Dr. Laurie Nadel, we are so glad that you came to share this with us today. Your story of not just recovery or not just the same old, same old. It's like you found purpose in a lot of things. And as a journalist turned therapist, and helping people with Reiki, it's just amazing. I want people to hear that it's not too late. You can always do something with your life, even if something bad happened to you. Something good can come out of it, but you
Yes.
kind of have to wait a while, go through the pain,
Yeah.
and then look for it. So have the
It
last
takes
word. Thank you.
Thank you. It takes a while to process. And again, that I said that patience is the unbearable gift. It's the one that we don't want, but it's the one that we really need the most when, things go bad.
Yes. Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you
Thank
very,
you.
very much. We appreciate your
Thank you.
work. And if anybody wants to get in contact with you, I'll put that on the notes. And I'm so glad we met.
Thank you. Me too. I'm so glad that we met. I really appreciate your having me on the show.
Thank
Thank you for
you.
your work. Thank you. Bye-bye.